Interstate 335 in Minneapolis was planned. It was funded. Homes were already being demolished to make room for it. And yet, somehow, it never happened. Not because the city ran out of money. Not because engineers forgot about it. But because across the country, people started asking a dangerous question. What if these highways were destroying more than they were connecting?
Welcome everyone, Sir Guana Moldy Cheese, inviting you on another trip through Northeast Minneapolis. Let's go walk.
Over the last few episodes, we've been walking through the story of Interstate 335. A highway that almost cut directly through this neighborhood. We walked streets that were nearly erased. We followed the invisible line the highway would have taken. And today, we are talking about why that line suddenly stopped. It's hard now, decades later, to really understand how unstoppable highways once felt. Today, if somebody proposed bulldozing an entire neighborhood for a freeway, there would be years of debate. Lawsuits. Public hearings. Environmental studies. Endless arguments online. But in the 1950s and 1960s, highways were treated almost like destiny. Bigger roads meant progress. Faster movement meant modernization. And modernization was considered unquestionably good. The creation of the Interstate Highway System was one of the largest infrastructure projects in human history. Thousands upon thousands of miles of roads. Bridges. Interchanges. Overpasses. Entire sections of cities were redesigned around cars. And to be fair, there were real benefits. Travel became faster. Shipping became easier. Cities became more connected. Entire industries grew because these roads existed. You could suddenly drive across huge sections of the country. In ways that earlier generations could barely imagine. And that's important to remember. Because this story is not really about highways being good or bad. It's about what happens when speed becomes more important than place. because those roads, no matter how useful they were,
had to go somewhere.
When engineers looked at maps, they often saw cities differently than the people living in them. Residents saw neighborhoods, memories, families, churches, corner stores, places people had lived for generations. But planners often saw efficiency, straight lines, easier land acquisition, lower property values, fewer political obstacles. And after a while, people began noticing a pattern. Highways rarely tore through wealthy areas. They rarely cut through places where powerful people lived. Instead, they often passed through working-class neighborhoods. Immigrant communities. Historically black neighborhoods. Places where people had fewer resources to fight back. Minneapolis and St. Paul had already seen this happen before. In the 1960s, The construction of Interstate 94 tore through the Rondo neighborhood. Rondo had been one of St. Paul's most important black communities. Homes disappeared. Businesses disappeared. Entire social networks disappeared. Families who had spent decades building lives there suddenly found themselves scattered. And when something like that happens, you cannot fully rebuild it. Even today, more than 50 years later, we are still feeling the impact of the Rondo neighborhood destruction. After enough stories like that, people start asking different questions. Not just how fast can we move traffic, but what happens to the people already living here? And suddenly, this wasn't just happening in Minneapolis. Across the country, communities began resisting proposed highways. In San Francisco, residents fought freeway expansions near the waterfront. In New York City, activists and neighborhood groups fought projects that would have cut through entire communities. In Baltimore, highway plans faced years of opposition. In New Orleans, residents helped stop plans that threatened the French Quarter. And little by little, something that once felt inevitable suddenly no longer did. People realized these projects could be challenged, delayed, changed, rerouted, or canceled entirely. And that's where Interstate 335 enters the story. Because by the time this project was moving forward, the mood in the country had already started changing. The idea that a highway could simply cut through a neighborhood without resistance no longer felt acceptable to anyone. The questions became personal. Why this neighborhood? Why these homes? Why this path? And maybe the biggest question of all, who gets to decide? What a city becomes. As we walk through Northeast Minneapolis, we talk about how the neighborhood feels slightly different. Not dramatically different. Not obviously different. Just enough that something feels slightly interrupted. And now we understand why. Because even though the highway was never finished, the process had already begun. Homes had already been purchased. families had already moved. Buildings had already disappeared. The line had already left its mark. And maybe that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because the final result is invisible to most people. There's no massive abandoned freeway here. No giant concrete ruins. Just a neighborhood, carrying subtle traces of something that almost happened. Somewhere behind us, the path we followed still points towards the Mississippi River. Towards a crossing that was planned, but never built. And because that crossing never happened, this neighborhood remained a neighborhood. That's the strange thing about cities. We usually notice what was built. The towers, the bridges, the roads. But sometimes, the things that matter most are the things that never happened. The road was planned. The route was drawn. Homes were cleared. But eventually, enough people questioned it. Enough communities resisted. That the future changed direction. And that's why these streets still exist. Why these houses still stand. Why people can still walk through this neighborhood slowly. Instead of flying through it at highway speed. Sometimes progress changes a city. And sometimes a city changes what progress means. Thank you for joining me on this walk through Northeast Minneapolis and through the story of the Minneapolis Highway Wars. As always, look to the future, but remember the past. Peace.